Good afternoon. My name is Audrey Cabanal, and I'm a student at the International School of Geneva. The empty chair on this panel is dedicated to Nargis Mohammadi, a mother of 2 children who is a physicist, engineer, journalist, human rights activist, and currently a political prisoner in Iran's notorious Evin prison. She was arrested and punished numerous times for her human rights activism. In May 2015, she was arrested and later sentenced to 16 years in prison for campaigning against the death penalty in Iran. Her husband, Taghi Rahmani, who addressed the Geneva summit in 2016, is also a human rights activist. He served 14 years of prison sentences and left Iran with the 2 children in 2012. Nargis stayed behind to continue her human rights work. Ms. Mohammadi's efforts to maintain a career in the sciences while speaking out about human rights abuses were unsuccessful. In 2009, she was dismissed from her position with an engineering company. The same year, she was arrested and incarcerated. Ms. Mohammadi served as spokesperson and vice president of the Defenders of Human Rights Center, an organization founded in 2001 by Nobel Peace Laureate Shirin Ebadi and closed by the government in 2008. There are serious concerns about her deteriorating health. On a typical day, Ms. Mohammadi is required to take between 11 to 14 different pills to tackle her various ailments. In a letter in 2016, she wrote, "The pain and suffering in Evin prison is beyond tolerance. Contrary to other prisons in Iran, there is no access to telephone in Evin prison, but it is a solitary confinement which is beyond any kind of acceptable imprisonment. Political prisoners who are considered dangerous terrorists are held in solitary confinement indefinitely. Detention in solitary confinement can vary from a day up to several years. The solitary confinement is used to get forced and false confessions out of the defendants. These false and faked confessions are used against the defendants during the trials. Many of the detainees in the solitary confinement are suffering from mental and physical health problems, and the injuries will remain with them for the rest of their life." In another letter in 2017, Ms. Mohammadi wrote, "At this moment, I would rather be a prisoner with free will than being superficially free outside of prison. I could be a woman who accepts not having human rights and stays quiet in the face of coercion and domination," she said. "But I prefer being a female dissident, even if it means going to prison. Today, we pledge never to forget Nargis Mohammadi." Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Maryam Nayeb-Yazdi. I'm an activist, consultant, and writer working in the field of human rights. In summer 2009, I founded Persian to English, a translation blog bringing human rights violations in Iran to an international audience. I join you today to speak about the recent mass protests that erupted in Iran in December 2017. But before doing so, I would like to briefly introduce the 2 of the speakers whom you will hear from shortly. So we have Maryam Malikpour. She is an incredibly brave and strong individual, she is a mechanical engineer residing in Vancouver, British Columbia. After she fled Iran in 2012, upon discovering that Iranian authorities were planning to arrest her for bringing international attention to the grave situation of her imprisoned brother, Saeed Malikpour. Maryam campaigns tirelessly for the freedom of Saeed, an innocent tech expert languishing in Evin prison. And I'm just going to show you an image of Saeed. And I would leave it to Maryam to tell you more about her brother's case and the nightmares she and her family have been through in basically a decade. And following my talk, we will hear from Mazyar Bahari, an Iranian-Canadian journalist and filmmaker who was a reporter for Newsweek from 1998 to 2011. While covering the 2009 election events in Iran, Mr. Bahari was jailed by the Iranian authorities for 118 days in Tehran's Evin prison. Mr. Bahari has written the New York Times bestseller, Then They Came For Me. His memoir is the basis for Jon Stewart's 2014 film, Rosewater. Mr. Bahari later founded the citizen journalism news site IranWire.com, the Freedom of Expression campaign, Journalism is Not a Crime, and the street art and social justice project, Paint the Change. And we look forward to hear from them shortly. The recent protests that began in Iran on December 28th and lasted for approximately a week came as a surprise to us all. It was arguably the first time since the 1979 revolution that we witnessed protests in every single province in Iran. But what didn't come as a surprise were the people's demands. For years, we have witnessed Iranians calling for fundamental changes of the government system while demanding civil liberties. We have also witnessed these brave people are being ignored by the Iranian authorities and not taken seriously by the international community. As the founder of Persian to English, a blog that aims to expose the human rights violations in Iran through translation, I strongly believe that the most effective way to understand the situation in Iran is to listen to the voices of the people in Iran struggling to exercise their fundamental rights. On January 7th, 2018, a few days after the Iran protests ended, civil rights defender Atina Dayemi wrote a letter from Evin prison. Atina and fellow civil rights defender Golrokh Irai are currently held in Tehran's Gharchak Varamin, one of Iran's most deplorable and dangerous prisons. And in that photo is also Golrokh's husband, Arash Sadeghi, who's also a civil rights defender, who is sentenced to 19 years in prison and is in Karaj's Rajai Shah prison currently. Here are some translated excerpts from Atina's letter. It is us, the people in the streets, who are protesting against the desecration of the country caused by the autocratic rulers and their policies. We want to return pride and honor to our dear Iran. We want our individual rights and social freedoms. The people of Iran demand resolutions to the issues we face, including poverty, unemployment, addiction, embezzlement, corruption, child labor, the repression of the LGBT community, the large gap between the social classes in Iran and the expenditure of the national capital for war in neighboring countries while Iranians live in poverty, lack of freedom of speech and religion, gender inequality, lack of occupational and economic security, and refusal of the Iranian authorities to officially recognize religious and ethnic minorities. The beloved people of Iran have suffered these issues for the past 40 years, and they have repeatedly expressed in various ways their demand for resolutions, but they have never received any response other than repression, murder, arrests, imprisonment, and exile. The international community hasn't paid adequate attention to the human rights situation in Iran, which has emboldened the Iranian government and left Iran's civil society at risk. Iran is best represented by its nonviolent civil rights defenders. Despite this, it is Hassan Rouhani and his administration who the international community seems to regard as the representative of Iranians. We have not seen much difference between Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Rouhani, except for their rhetoric and the image that they display of themselves to the international community. In his presidential campaigning, Rouhani criticized Ahmadinejad administration's treatment of protesters and for filtering the internet. But when the recent protests erupted, Rouhani's administration arrested and jailed thousands of protesters and filtered the internet. We were even witness to the killing of protesters. To justify the recent violent crackdown on protesters, Iranian authorities claimed that the protesters weren't citizens with legitimate concerns, but rather a bunch of thugs. Civil rights defender Jafar Eqdami wrote a letter from Karaj's Rajai Shar prison, where Arash Sadiqi is also held, regarding the recent protests. Here are some excerpts from his letter. State-run TV station IRIB labeled the protesters as anarchists, rioters, troublemakers, Zionists, or affiliates of America who inflicted damage onto public property. However, it is the government powers in Iran who are directly responsible for these possible damages. When independent organizations in Iran are faced with severe restrictions and oppression, how can a young Iranian learn civil, rational, and peaceful protest? It is these independent civil society organizations who are able to teach the citizens democratic principles, restraint, and rational behavior. The damages caused during the recent protests don't compare to the damages the government has caused to the national interests of Iranians for the past 40 years. It is not even comparable. Iranians have demonstrated time and again that they aren't aligned with the Iranian government's domestic and foreign policies. We have witnessed Iranian protesters chant slogans such as, "Abandon the nuclear program, think of our well-being instead. Leave Syria, think of us instead. Not for Gaza, not for Lebanon, I give my life only for Iran." And the Iranian authorities have demonstrated time and again that they will do whatever it takes to silence the voices of the Iranian people. If the voices of Iranians gained strength, the authorities would be under much pressure to change their behavior. As a result of inadequate pressure from the international community, there is no incentive for the Iranian authorities to change their behavior. There is too much political and economic power at stake, and they are fighting for their survival. A large majority of the international community's attention on Iran goes to the missiles and nuclear programs. However, if we wish to resolve these issues, there needs to be a focus on changing the overall behavior of the Iranian authorities. For example, sanctions issued against Iran for the nuclear program succeeded to bring the Iranian government to the negotiating table. But at the same time, the Iranian authorities continued their human rights violations and proxy wars. We saw little to no change in the behavior of the Iranian authorities. To change the behavior of the Iranian government, the international community needs a human rights-focused approach and must take multiple actions simultaneously. Some of these actions are: put human rights at the top of the agenda of any bilateral talks. Issue sanctions that help end the repression of Iranian civil society, rather than sanctions that hurt the Iranian people, such as issuing sanctions against telecommunications companies that provide the Iranian government with tools and services used to suppress Iranians. Ease the free flow of information in and to Iran. And finally, maximize efforts to support the pro-democracy movement in Iran and help elevate the voices of Iran's civil rights defenders. If these actions are not taken simultaneously, the vicious cycle of violence will continue. The international community needs to make the political and economic costs for committing human rights violations too high for the Iranian government. This would make introducing reforms advantageous. As I mentioned earlier, Iranians are not aligned with the government's domestic and foreign policies. The more reforms that are implemented in Iran, the bigger the space for Iranians to speak out and pressure the Iranian authorities to change their behavior in regards to the nuclear and missiles programs, and think twice before using the nation's capital to fund proxy wars. It is the Iranian people who are able to place the most pressure on the Iranian government, as it is the Iranian people whom the Iranian authorities fear the most. I will end with a quote from a letter written by Mohammad Saber Malik Raisi from Ardabil prison for the occasion of his 26th birthday. Mohammad was under the age of 17 at the time of his arrest. He is the youngest person to be arrested in Iran on political charges. The English translation of the quote: torture, pressures, and oppression will not stop us, the people of Iran, from demanding our human rights. Thank you. Now I will call upon Maziar Bahari. Thank you.